I was 12 minutes late to the steakhouse that Tuesday night in Chicago. The kind of late that happens when your clients need answers and your fiancé only needs another drink. Dalton was already at the table with Griffin, Lydia, and Sienna, laughing in our usual corner booth like he hadn't spent the last year living inside a life my money kept polished. I was still 3 steps behind his chair when I heard him say, with that easy voice I used to mistake for confidence, "I'm not marrying her. I'm just waiting for the cleanest way out." Nobody saw me yet, which gave me the full shape of it before anyone could soften it. And the shape was uglier than cheating because it was organized. Griffin leaned in, amused already, and Dalton took another sip of bourbon before saying Marin is good at arranging things. But I need a woman with real weight, real ambition, real presence. Sienna gave a low laugh and added that we'd all been watching this drag on too long. And that single word, we, told me she was not an accident, not a temptation, not a mistake. Then Griffin asked the question that turned humiliation into structure. When? And Dalton answered like he was discussing a campaign rollout instead of our wedding 6 weeks away. He said he'd been creating distance on purpose, making us feel incompatible so I would pull the plug myself, and he could walk away looking patient, mature, almost generous. Lydia finally noticed me standing there, but she only froze with her glass halfway lifted. And no one warned him because apparently even decency had become too expensive at that table. When Dalton turned and saw me, every bit of borrowed swagger fell out of his face so fast it almost made the room feel quiet, even with cutlery still clinking around us. I took off my ring, set it on the white tablecloth between his drink and Sienna's hand, and told him that at least now I knew which wedding deposits were worth trying to save. Then I looked at each of them once and said the apartment, the dinners, the weekends. The polished version of Dalton Reeves they kept cheering for had all been running through me, and that ended before I took my next breath. By the time I reached my car, the humiliation had already hardened into sequence. Because once you hear your own wedding described like a staged exit, emotion becomes logistics. I locked the doors, set my purse on the passenger seat, and called my bank before Dalton could start rewriting the night into something softer, smaller, easier to survive. When the representative verified my identity, I asked her to remove Dalton from every card where he had authorized access, issue replacements overnight, and flag anything unusual immediately. Then I opened my laptop in the dark parking lot and started pulling up every account that had ever mistaken my stability for our future, beginning with email. Passwords changed first, then travel profiles, utility logins, food delivery apps, shared subscriptions, and the rewards accounts Dalton loved treating like proof he belonged somewhere expensive. I made a 4-column note titled Money, Contracts, Access, Property, and the list filled faster than my breathing settled, because evidence never needed help once I finally stopped protecting him from it. There were recurring charges for dinners he had framed as networking, membership fees attached to clubs where no real client had ever appeared, and travel holds for weekends I had funded. I canceled what I could cancel, documented what I could not, and emailed the wedding planner, the venue, and the florist with the kind of clean language people use when something personal has become administrative. Losing deposits hurt, but not as much as seeing how many payments had gone through my name just to keep Dalton dressed like a man with options. My phone lit up across the console with his name. Then Griffin, then Sienna, then Lydia, all of them arriving too late now that the table had finally become a receipt. I let every call die unanswered, because the only voices I needed that night belonged to customer service, confirmation emails, and the quiet click of access disappearing. By the time my bank sent the final alert that new cards were on the way, the first clean feeling I'd had in months was sitting right there with me, sharp and undeniable. I met Dalton at a hospitality fundraiser 2 years earlier, where he moved through the room like someone who belonged in every expensive corner he touched. He knew which champagne to order, which donor to flatter, which valet to tip too casually. And when he smiled at me and said, "You look like you run rooms," I believed he meant it. What I did not understand then was that men like Dalton rarely build the world they stand in. They just learn how to pose inside it long enough for someone else to cover the bill. At first, the asks came wrapped in timing. Never greed. Always one inconvenience away from being solved. A delayed payment here. A card issue there. A client dinner he promised to repay. I picked up the check once. Then twice. Then so many times that by the end of that first year, my generosity had become infrastructure and his gratitude had become style. The evidence had been there from the beginning, hiding in plain sight inside receipts for jackets bought before big meetings, rides booked after industry calls, and reservations at places where nobody ever discussed actual work. When Dalton started calling himself independent, the word only meant he had found cleaner language for dependence, and I was too busy working to stop and measure the difference. His club membership was for networking, except the photos showed lounge chairs, golf simulators, and Griffin grinning beside drinks I knew had landed on my card by morning. The weekends he framed as pitch retreats kept ending in resort invoices, and Sienna was already there in half the tagged photos. Close enough to matter, distant enough to deny. Griffin and Lydia had been woven into it too. Not as masterminds, not as innocents, but as the kind of people who never ask questions when the table stays full. They knew Dalton always reached for the check with confidence and never noticed, or pretended not to notice. That confidence only arrived because my account backed it. By the time I sat in my car that Tuesday night, staring at recurring charges and canceled bookings, I could finally see the full design, clearly enough to name it. And the ugliest part was how ordinary it had looked while it was happening. By morning, Dalton had stopped pretending the night at the restaurant was a misunderstanding and started flooding my phone with messages that leaned on panic, damage control, and blame. I did not answer, but I read enough to hear the strategy inside them, because every line tried to shrink what I had heard into bad timing. Bad optics. Bad phrasing. Then Sienna texted me directly, and the fact that she felt comfortable crossing that line told me she had never believed she was hidden. Her message was brief, polished, and uglier than anything Dalton sent, because she wrote like someone protecting a plan, not apologizing for a mistake. She told me I should walk away quietly, spare myself more embarrassment, and stop forcing a relationship that had already run its course in private. She also referenced the venue date, the floral balance, and the guest count. And women do not casually know those numbers unless someone has been briefing them against your life. An hour later, the part I had already suspected became impossible to soften when an email landed in my inbox from a shared travel folder Dalton forgot, still copied me. Attached to a weekend confirmation was a thread between him and Sienna, and the language was so clean it read less like an affair and more like a schedule. Wait until after the final vendor deadline. Let her feel the distance. If she cancels first. I stay clean. And underneath that, Sienna had typed, "She will not beg once she understands the message." I forwarded the entire thread to Rowan Pike, the attorney whose name a client once gave me for situations where emotion needed to move behind process immediately. Then I sent building management Dalton's photo, revoked his access code, and arranged that anything he needed to collect would happen once. Through the front desk. On record. By noon, the betrayal had changed shape in my mind, because cheating was one kind of wound. But planning my humiliation around my own wedding payments was colder, and I was done calling cold men complicated. The fallout hit their circle fast, because once Dalton lost access to my cards, their easy dinners and last-minute plans had to survive money. Reservations started falling apart. Weekend chatter went quiet, and Griffin texted first, asking if I was going to turn that ugly night into a war. I answered once and told him the private part ended when they all treated my humiliation like entertainment. 2 days later, Lydia asked to meet for coffee near the museum where she worked, and the request told me the silence was cracking. She looked exhausted when I arrived, turning her cup in both hands before admitting nobody at that table had been as shocked as they acted. She said Sienna had been around for months, not weeks, and everyone knew Dalton let me pay so often it had become normal. I did not ask Lydia for loyalty, forgiveness, or a polished apology, because by then truth mattered more when it came without decoration. I only asked if Dalton had been planning to push me into canceling the wedding myself, and she lowered her eyes long enough to answer yes. That one word did more than anything else she said, because it confirmed the story Dalton would later sell had already been rehearsed. By the time I left, the balance had shifted in ways none of them could reverse, because money and silence were no longer protecting anybody there. Griffin was the man who laughed while living off someone else's generosity. Lydia was the woman who knew and froze, and Sienna was impossible to frame as an accident. I did not leave with closure, but I left with something more useful, which was proof that I had never imagined the rot. Dalton did not stop when the money stopped, which was how I knew this was never only about comfort, because comfort usually retreats when access does. He started showing up where my actual life was, first outside my office building, then through calls from numbers I did not recognize, then by emailing my work address with subject lines that tried to sound urgent and intimate. The ugliest turn came when building security called upstairs and told me a man downstairs was insisting I was unstable, overwhelmed, and needed to be taken home before I embarrassed myself. I called Rowan from my desk while that message was still hot in my body, and she stripped the emotion out of it fast enough to give me room. Save every voicemail, every screenshot, every arrival time, every witness name, she said, because men like Dalton survive by turning patterns into isolated incidents. So I started logging everything the same day. The dates he appeared, the reception tier desk notes, the forwarded emails, and the exact language he used when he tried to make my refusal sound like a breakdown. Rowan sent a cease and desist, then a single retrieval notice for Dalton's remaining things. And the beauty of it was not cruelty, but containment. He was given one window, one location, one process, and none of it included my phone, my hallway, my door, or another chance to pull me into a private performance. When the day came, he stood in the lobby looking smaller than I had ever seen him, signing for 2 boxes and a garment bag under the flat light of the concierge desk. He tried once, lifting his head and saying, "Marin, 5 minutes." Like time had not already been the thing he stole most cleanly from me. I stayed where Rowan told me to stay, visible but unreachable, and let the concierge tell him the pickup was complete and the building expected him to leave. Then Dalton walked out carrying the exact weight that was his. No more access. No audience. No soft landing. And for the first time in 3 years, that was all he got. After Dalton carried out the last of his things, the apartment stopped feeling like a place I had defended and started feeling like a place I could finally hear myself think. I moved 3 weeks later into a smaller condo near the river, with better light, cleaner lines, and none of the invisible drag that comes from financing someone else's identity. The first night there, I ate takeout on the floor, looked at the boxes I had packed alone, and realized peace felt less like triumph than oxygen returning. At work, the hours I used to spend managing Dalton's moods folded back into my own life, and my numbers shifted almost immediately. I took the promotion I had delayed, expanded my client list, and stopped apologizing for wanting a schedule built around my work instead of somebody else's excuses. When my first quarterly report came in higher than projected, I stared at the increase longer than I should have, because that column proved more than any apology ever could. Lydia wrote once, not to smooth anything over, but to say she should have spoken that night and hated the version of herself that stayed quiet. I did not give her absolution, but I answered that truth counted more when it arrived without a request attached to it. After that, I cooked what I liked, slept through the night, booked travel for myself without checking anyone else's mood, and let the shape of my days stop bending around rescue. What changed was not my softness, my ambition, or my capacity to love, but the fact that I finally understood those things did not have to be offered without limits. I had spent years confusing usefulness with intimacy, and once Dalton was gone, every receipt, every canceled charge, and every uninterrupted morning made the difference impossible to miss. That was the power in it. Not that I became harder, but that I became unavailable to anything that needed me smaller to survive. About 8 months after Dalton left with those boxes, I heard through Lydia that he and Sienna were suddenly everywhere online, dressed up as proof they had chosen correctly together. The captions were all language I recognized from him. Talk about alignment, real partnership, mutual belief, the kind of polished nonsense that always appears when the bills are still hidden. Then a message came from an unknown number, and before I even opened it, I knew Dalton wanted me to witness his next performance from the front row again personally. He wrote that Sienna believed in his vision, that he had finally found someone who understood him, and that I should be happy he was with his equal at last. I deleted it without answering, because the interesting part was never what Dalton announced, only the speed with which he reused the same script on a different woman, again publicly. Months later, Lydia called and told me the new engagement had already started fraying, because Sienna had discovered that confidence, like everything else around Dalton, arrived unpaid and on credit. The dinners were smaller, the excuses were familiar, and the money had started moving in the same direction it always had, toward him, away from whoever loved him most recently. When Sienna finally understood that I had not ruined Dalton's life, I had only interrupted his access to mine. She cut him off and sent him back home for good. I felt no temptation to warn, rescue, or explain, because by then I understood Dalton had not lost me in one moment. He had merely revealed his pattern too clearly. A year after Dalton walked out of that building with 2 boxes and a garment bag, a journalist reached me through a client who knew pieces of what had happened. He was working on a story about financial manipulation inside relationships, and when he asked whether I would speak on record, I said yes under one condition. I told him he could use my story, my numbers, my timeline, and the truth of what Dalton had done, but he would not get Dalton's real name. By then, I understood something I had not understood when I left that restaurant with my ring in my hand and my whole body shaking. I did not need Dalton exposed to feel restored, because exposure is still a form of orbit, and I was no longer interested in circling him. I needed the pattern named clearly enough that another woman might hear her own life in mine before she spent years funding a man who despised her. When the article came out, the responses arrived from women in cities I had never been to, with jobs, marriages, breakups, invoices, and stories that sounded painfully familiar. They wrote about men who called dependence partnership, men who framed accountability as cruelty, and men who loved access so much they mistook it for intimacy. Reading those messages in my own kitchen, with my own mortgage draft waiting on the counter, I felt something steadier than revenge settle into place. The last update I ever got about Dalton came through Lydia, who said he was back where he started, still blaming women for every door that had closed. I remember looking around my condo, at the contracts on my table, the quiet I had paid for myself, and thinking that was finally enough. Dalton did not lose because I destroyed him. He lost because the kind of life he wanted could only exist if someone like me kept carrying him. And I stopped. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the parts that break before they heal. If any of this felt close to your own life, I hope you choose peace sooner than I did. Stay kind to yourself, and stay open to steadier love.